Now, one of the big issues in South Africa, or more than one issue, is the issue of government, political leadership, business leadership, and certainly with civil society when it comes to COVID-19. Up to now, we often talk about COVID-19 in terms of health issues and wealth issues, but it's a whole lot more complex than that. So I thought let's get some answers from somebody who certainly knows, Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, who was a political analyst based at the University of Pretoria, and it's not just answers. You're hopefully going to give us the big picture into what we see, particularly around leadership in the times of COVID-19. So good talking to you.
It's a pleasure talking to you, Ashraf. COVID-19 is such a comprehensive problem, if ever there was one. There is not an area of life that it doesn't touch. There's not a sector that is not touched by it. And for that reason, it's very difficult to think of, to isolate big issues. I mean, ostensibly, it's about health. It really is a virus that affects people's health and may lead to death, as we have seen the numbers of dying people rising across the world. But it's a comprehensive challenge. It is a challenge to the economy. It's a challenge to culture. It's a challenge to health, as mentioned. It's also a challenge to the way people, to funerary rites, if you like, the way we bury, the way we recognize one another, the way we greet, the way we learn, the way we interact. All of these things are affected by it.
Well, I think it's important points you bring up, and that's why I want to zoom in specifically into the issues of leadership. So these challenges are not of our making. I mean, it's a pandemic, it's a global issue. But let's start with government. How has government, in your opinion, how have they responded to these various challenges thrown at them?
Let me start on the kind side and say that there are worse governments in the world in terms of how the COVID-19 pandemic has been handled. Our government is not one of them. And we could sit here and give examples of government which have been terrible, dismal in the way in which they have responded. South African government must be commended for the speed with which they have responded, and even for the lockdown, about which there is so much disagreement now. That intervention was timely. I think there is universal agreement that they intervened at the right time. We can now talk about some of the problems that have emerged. So, by and large, our government has been fantastic. The leadership of President Ramaphosa is fantastic as far as we have handled this matter. However, some cracks have begun to show in the way in which government has been handling this. Cracks to do with communication, in particular communication within cabinet, but also communication between cabinet and ourselves. Cracks have begun to show that have led people to begin to ask questions about the extent to which our interventions are always informed by science, and about the legality of some of the actions that government has taken. And so those are some of the things that we could talk about as far as the problems that have emerged in the effort of our government to lead us and to provide a COVID-19 strategy that makes sense and that has buy-in from the citizens.
And these cracks that you talk about, are they a reflection of actual problems, or are they simply how media, how you and I, consumers of what we see, how we then process it? So what I'm saying, are the cracks real or are they perceived?
Well, the difference between perception and reality is academic. What people perceive is real to them, and perception is reality in that sense. Some of the, you have to suppose that some of the cracks supposed are not real. But when the president says something today, and the minister responsible for the management of the National Disaster Act says something that seems to contradict him tomorrow, then it's not just a matter of perception. It's serious cracks. When the official opposition goes to challenge aspects of the rationale behind the lockdown as well as the implementation of it, it's not mere perception. It's real. It's a real sign that there are cracks developing between them. And when you have a few citizens dying, not due to COVID-19, but due to action or lack thereof by members of the police or the army, then you know that we have cracks and gaps in the manner in which we are handling this. And when you see the long queues of South African citizens looking for food at this time, and food riots breaking up in some places, then you know that these cracks are not mere perception, they are real.
But it gets me to ask you this important question as we get into the big picture around government leadership here, right? Which is, so to repeat, COVID-19 is certainly not of our doing. It's happened. It's a global pandemic. It exists in just about every country in the world, right? Has the decisions that government have made, have the decisions made and taken by them, by and large, are they the correct decisions? And I think primarily it's the issue around social distancing, and lockdown is a manifestation of that. And then to enforce social distancing, by police, by the army, which on the one hand does mean that the economy grounds to a halt. So my question then is to try and understand the bigger picture in terms of the key decisions government have made, specifically around the handling of COVID-19. Now, it comes, what seems to be the method is social distancing, flattening the curve based upon advice from scientists, and that meant, of course, that the economy then grounds to the halt because of lockdown being a manifestation of social distancing, and it also means enforcement of the lockdown not by voluntary actions, but by the police and by the defense force. So in your opinion, has government made the right choices in doing just that?
Yeah, Ashraf, I hope you hear and see me clearly. I was losing you towards the end of your question. My sense is that at the strategic level, at the highest strategic level, our government has been 100% correct in terms of deciding to intervene in the manner they did, when they did, in terms of setting up the Ministerial Advisory Committee, which is a committee consisting of experts, and using that committee to inform them and dialoguing all the time with members of that committee, in terms of the consultations that the government has had to do with all important sectors in society before, during, and during the lockdown. At that highest strategic level, the government has been fantastic. However, I think that when it comes to implementation and interpretation of some of the regulations that have been invoked, there has been a lot of problems. So, for example, the president has said that there won't be any skop, skit, and donor. That was the promise right at the beginning, which was a beautiful promise. His speech to the army was one of, in my view, a very important milestone in our march, as it were, against COVID-19. But since then, some members of the army have not made good of that promise, and they've gone, in some cases, to the other extreme. The ministers have not always communicated coherently, meaningfully to people, let alone some of the more disagreeable stuff that we have seen. But just making sure that one message is communicated coherently across the board. That has not always been happening. And for me, that's a very important area of problems. But the real big issue, Ashraf, is this, that all the problems that we have had as a country all along, long before COVID-19, have now risen up to the surface. What COVID-19 has done is to expose us for who we really are as a country, in terms of the inequality, in terms of the unemployment, in terms of the economy that was already comatose even before the lockdown, and all of those problems that we have had as a nation have now been complicated even further by COVID-19.
And let's just say with that point, I mean, does that, is it fair? Now we know where the problems arose. Is it fair to blame the current administration, the Ramaphosa administration for all of this?
No, I don't think we can blame the Ramaphosa administration for our economic problems and for the problems of inequality. But we can, of course, ask the question as to whether this administration, since it came into power, which was 2 years ago, because he has been president not just from last year, we can check if he has made any progress. And if there is an area where his administration seems to have not shifted anything, it is in the area of the economy. He's done very well in terms of building some sense of nationhood, some national cohesion, his Tumamina strategy, his fundraising strategy across the world, and so on. But economically, we haven't shifted at all. And so COVID-19 found us struggling already and has made things very much worse. Now, the interventions that have been made by government since COVID-19, the increment of the social grant system, the relief fund, the solidarity fund, all of these are not bad things at all. But in many ways, they are like crumbs that are being thrown at people who are really, really struggling at this time.
Let's talk about the army that you alluded to. So yes, that particular send off from the president, speaking about you are going to war with an unseen enemy, and I think it's very telling, and it brought to the fore the gravity of what we all face, right? But an army should be defending South Africa. Now we understand the need to impose certain rules to ensure that people don't abuse it. But why do you think there's been more than one case of the army overreaching? I'm puzzled as to why that would happen.
Look, perhaps we should not think that 25 years is enough time for a nation to change its ways fundamentally. And so our army and our police tend to revert back to the default. They tend to default on violence. And we have seen this happen in Marikana. It was a specific case. We have seen it happen now during COVID-19. It seems to me that the script of violence is so deeply embedded in the way our army operates and the police operate that when you put them under stress, the first thing they do is to go back there. And we have seen this happen also in other militaristic, countries that have militaristic histories and backgrounds, like Nigeria. The army there has been rather ruthless, and so have been the police during this time. And it has to do with the history of where we are coming from. I mean, if you think about it, the man who was killed in Alexander, near Alexander in East Bank, the story is quite shocking, because he was in his own yard drinking a beer and got it into an argument with the army. But the army was not big enough to say, we are the big guys here, we can behave better because no law has been broken. Instead, they went toe to toe with this ordinary man, and in the end, he lost his life in their hands. So that's one of the problems, is history. But the other problem is that the current leadership of the army and the police has not been very helpful. So the Minister of Police has been talking it up, if you like. He has been scolding the nation. He has been praising the police for their overreach, and refusing to yield any acre to citizens who have been complaining about the behavior of the police. The minister of the South African Defence Force, we hang our head in shame after one death, but the follow-up actions did not show any remorse. Instead, the family had to go to court. So it's both the history and the manner in which the current leadership is dealing with the current crisis. And I haven't had the president talk to these ministers who have spoken to us as if we were the virus, and that we were to be arrested, as it were, like the virus. And it's such a huge misunderstanding. You know, Ashraf, sometimes I wonder whether the National Disaster Management Act is the best instrument for dealing with the current situation that we have. Because what it has done is to push forward the Minister of Police, the Minister of Defense, and the Minister of Cocta. It's in the nature of that act that these are the people who will be pushed forward. And the Minister of Health is not really the leader as far as that act is concerned. I mean, he's done very well, but his role is not that of leadership. And I have a sense that, I mean, fortunately, Minister Dlamini Zuma is also a medical doctor. That helps. But I think the wrong set of ministers have been asked to take the lead in a pandemic that is essentially a health issue in a nation that is democratic, where dignity of human beings ought to be uppermost all the time.
Okay, so if this is not the right instrument, because it's put to the fore certain leaders who may not even be seen as natural leaders, then what, in your opinion, should have been the instruments to still effect the same level of commitment to lockdown, to keep social distancing, to keep the country on its toes, and being aware of the need that the risks around COVID-19 is extremely high?
Yeah, I know you're putting me on the spot now, Ashraf, but we only really have two instruments in the country at the moment. I mean, we have the state of emergency, and we've got the National Disaster Management Act. And government had to choose between the two, and they chose the latter, obviously because they didn't want to go the route of a state of emergency, because that's where we have been. There's a painful history of state of emergency declarations in this country during apartheid years. And I suspect that that's why they steered away from it. And they looked for a softer, more noble instrument, as it were. And I understand that. But I sometimes think that in its application, this instrument, they have almost behaved as if what we are under is a state of emergency and not state of national disaster. Certainly, the army seems to think that this is a state of emergency. And certainly the cabinet, the National Command Council, sometimes seems to think that way, because why do we have a curfew between 6 and, is it
After
8 and
p.m.,
6?
yeah.
So if you look at that, and a lockdown in itself is already a curfew. And so you still want to have a curfew, and then you still say people must exercise between 6 and 9 in the morning. In my neighborhood, what happens is that little crowds form between 7 and 9 in the morning all over the streets. I don't think that's very safe. I think, in fact, you're putting people at risk of infection because you're forcing them to do this activity all at once in a very short period of time, because very few people are up and running at 6. And so generally it will be sometimes between 7:30 and 9 that you will find your streets overcrowded. So I have a sense that it's the instrument. Okay, to go back to your point where you're putting me on the spot. Mm-hmm. What instrument would work better? I don't know that we have one. But I would have liked to see a situation where the Minister of Health is the leader of the national effort, because this is substantively a health challenge that we are faced with. We don't need the Minister of COGTA and the Minister of Police to be in our faces every day when the actual issue is public health. So there should be an instrument that puts the Minister of Public Health and Health right behind the president. We don't have that at the moment. We have the president, because the cabinet has done very well in creating the Ministerial Advisory Committee, and making sure that they liaise very closely with them. But I still wonder whether an act designed for natural disasters such as floods and earthquakes and so on is the best one for a public health issue around a virus as difficult as COVID-19 or coronavirus, novel coronavirus.
Well, it certainly gets me thinking about who's making the decisions then. We have the president on top and the Minister of Health, and both of us think they're key, but there's a whole lot of others included that you've just mentioned already. Ultimately, who makes the decisions and who advises whoever it is that finally makes the decisions?
Well, that question a month ago, 54 days ago, we wouldn't have asked that question, because we assumed that the president was in charge, and we understood why Minister Dlamini Zuma was stepping forward, because her department is the owner of the National Disaster Management apparatus. And she has the role of declaring a state of national disaster. But I think when the president kept referring to the National Command Council, saying the National Command Council has decided, the National Command Council will consider, the National Command Council will do this and that, people started to worry about the status of the National Command Council. Because the National Command Council, its bona fides is probably easy to justify. My suspicion is that in the provisions of the National Disaster Act, there is space for an entity. It may not be called the National Command Council. It may have a slightly different name, but there is space for an entity similar to that, which assists in times like this. But does that entity take away the power of the president? Does that entity take away the power of cabinet? Does it take away the power of parliament? All of these questions have become relevant, especially as it has seemed that the president and the command council and members of his cabinet may not always be singing from the same hymn, even though they have same hymn book.
And that's something that's been brought up by a few people, that the president appears to be very consultative, and that I think most leaders ought to be doing anyway. But once he consults with his command council and his cabinet ministers, it appears that they themselves, those leaders in cabinet as part of the command council, they themselves appear to be not very consultative, not very consultative, and B, they appear to be unclear in terms of why certain decisions have been made. What are your thoughts on that?
My sense is that perhaps the president operates at the most strategic level and trusts members of his cabinet to cascade and translate the strategy into actions, if you like. And the problem happens in the translation of the strategy into action. So there is a social distancing strategy, for example. And one minister stands up and says, in order to action this, you may not buy short sleeve shirts unless that short sleeve shirt is indicated as one that can be worn under a jacket. And I've never seen a shop that makes those kinds of indications. Another then decides we are going to have a curfew, and the curfew will be between this time and that time. Another says exercises should not be allowed, and then eventually after pressure, let's allow it, but only between 6 and 9. I don't know that the president is fully appraised at this level of translation from strategy to action. And I think that he will need to become more involved at that level of the translation and not merely at the level of strategy. The other problem is that even when strategy has been translated into action, you still have to communicate that action clearly, but also with justification. You can't just say cigarettes will not be sold without providing a justification. We are a constitutional democracy. People should not hand over their rights and then also not be given explanations as to why certain actions are being taken. And in the area of justifying and explaining the actions, members of cabinet have not always covered themselves in glory.
But why do you think they've done that? Why have they not bothered explaining some of the key decisions made? Because I mean, you just made the point. We all understand better when decisions that we don't particularly like are explained. So, okay, now we know. So from a communications point of view, it would be an absolute given that it should be explained well. Why do you think that's not been done?
Well, there could be many reasons. One of them is simply that these ministers are not necessarily best communicators. Just because a person is the minister of a particular portfolio does not make them a great communicator. And until now, they themselves have been the communicators. They have been asked to become communicators overnight, and they've battled, really battled. Some of them are better at it than others. So it's a question of competence. It's a question of skill. But there's another problem. I think the other problem is that, people do get tempted and excited when they have power. In the same way that you have a soldier who stops you on the roadside and say, you smell of liquor, when in fact you have not touched liquor, just, to intimidate you. You also have ministers who, given the power that they have discovered, a little further than they should with that power. And that, I think, is part of the problem that we've had. And not to include other problems that lower down the level, problems of corruption. We have got this big fund now that the president has said should be used for relief. And if you cascade further down and further down and further down, there are many problems where corruption rears its ugly head, and you can never know whether it's incompetence at those levels or willful decisions in order to make space for all manner of corrupt activities to take place.
Yeah, so the problems are clearly multiple, right? Do you get a sense that the South African public we're talking by and large, of course, in broad strokes, are they by and large supportive of the president? Are they by and large supportive of the National Command Council's decisions and how it then cascades? Or do you think there's increased resistance and a reluctance to accept them now?
Look, what is clear is that the clamor for level 3 has become almost unstoppable. And that clamor comes from everywhere, from every corner. And the DA has tried to tap on that dis-ease nationally by going to court. But they are by no means the originators of it. There is a mood of fatigue in the country. But I think South Africans have been amazing in terms of understanding the need for a lockdown and in terms of adjusting their behavior in as quick a time as I've ever seen in this country. Within a few weeks, South Africans were wearing masks. Within a few weeks, South Africans were encouraging one another to stay at home. I've seen a lot of social media hashtags that are designed to encourage people to stay at home. And I've seen other creative interventions by ordinary citizens to try and make sure that this particular project works. So I think South Africans remain pretty much committed to the project of fighting COVID-19. Government must just make sure that they don't erode the trust that South Africans have given them, and that they don't become illegitimate in the eyes of South Africans, and especially with the actions of the army, the actions of some ministers, and so on. So President will have to be very careful, because once trust is lost, it's much, much harder to regain. And I don't think all of it has been lost yet.
So those that are confident amongst us about leadership will say, by and large, that the president has made, and his command council have made some decisions, some great ones, some poor ones, but by and large, we understand why they've made those decisions, and we've had to sacrifice a huge part of our lives in doing just that. The skeptics amongst us are suggesting that this entire issue is a ruse to try and put a clamp on citizenry, and this is the beginning of a slide into authoritarian leadership. Your take on that?
I think the latter perception is a bit over the top. We all know that COVID-19 is a global problem. We have seen scenes, scary, disturbing scenes in countries like Italy, in countries like Spain, where they almost have resorted to mass burials because of COVID-19. We have seen the alarming situation that is developing in the USA. We all watch TV. We see what is happening in the world, and we have watched China struggle with this challenge. So there is no way that anyone can accuse government of simply wanting to command and control. I think that at the strategic level, government is trying to do the right thing, and trying to stop us from reaching the Italy, Spain, France kinds of levels of infections and ratio between infection and deaths, because that ratio has to be controlled. If it is not controlled, we will be in trouble. Our whole health system is nowhere. It's not even half of the health system that either Spain or France or the UK has. And if they struggled the way they did, clearly we have to do a little more in terms of prevention than they did, and we have learned from them, as it were. So I think people understand this about government. That said, people will not understand decisions and regulations, or rather regulations that are not properly explained. People will not understand a president who constantly refers to the National Command Council as the ultimate authority. They will not understand that. People will not understand why a father of 3 children, aged 13, 12, and 10, outside Alexander, had to be killed inside his own yard, and his own wife had to be beaten up by the police, and so was his brother-in-law in the process, if the court papers are anything to go by. People will not understand that. So go to level 3, go to level 2, but explain. Don't make it look like you are making it up all the time. We decide today level 3 includes this. No, it excludes this. And tomorrow, what was level 3 becomes level 4, and what was level 4 becomes level 5. All of these things, government will just have to be careful, because I think people have given them the benefit of the doubt, and they continue to look up to government for leadership. People are also scared for their health, and worried about their jobs, and worried about their livelihoods. All of these things come together. And my sense is that we will soon move into a phase, Ashraf, where issues of mental health will become very, very important. At the moment, it is the doctors, the medical technologists who are testing people, but very soon it will be the psychiatrists and the psychologists who will have to step up as people begin to panic and to worry and to become stressed and to suffer, and not merely physically, but also mentally.
Well, I think you raised an important point. We're speaking now a few days before lockdown 3, and ironically, I just tweeted recently about saying that yes, between my wife and I, we bung and we skrik, and I think that's a mental part in terms of psychologically how we face the realities of poor health on the one hand, or the threats to your health and to your lives, but the issue of an economic strangulation, right? That gets me out, bringing up this issue. As we now move imminently into lockdown 3, you've made a point that it is a question about life and livelihood. Has the government, in broad strokes, have they got that right in terms of how they managed those two interests?
They've tried hard. Government has really tried hard to strike a balance between health and livelihoods, life and livelihoods. They really have. Insofar as when the lockdown was at level 5, we saw government reaching out to the poor, to the homeless, and so on and so forth. We saw them lining up water tankers to take water to areas where there is no water, even though that did not always work as well as it was planned to. So I think they've tried to strike the balance. The question is, how long can you stretch this? At what point have you taken it so far down the road that the one begins to erode the other? Now, at any given time, South African poor people have got always a larger choice of premature forms of death. And when you reach a point where people go into the street and say, I can choose to die of COVID-19 or to die of hunger. If you have more and more South Africans who feel that they are in that space, then you've gone too far. You've gone too far in terms of pushing this. And I think that's why government is now thinking of moving to level 3. Certainly in most of the country. My suspicion is that most of the country will go to level 3, but a few places may remain at level 4. That's a sign that they still want to maintain that balance. between life and livelihood.
So that's an important point. So going to level 3 is not a evidence of a country having the disease under control, but it is evidence of the country understanding that side by side with getting the disease under control and practicing social distancing is the need to open up the economy and the inherent risks in both, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, level 3 may be a more dangerous space than level 4 and level 5 was, as far as the disease is concerned. So level 3 may be a place which is more dangerous than level 4. It's why we are going back to a situation where there will be more and more social interaction between people. They'll be wearing masks, hopefully, but everybody knows that what masks do is to protect others and not necessarily and the virus is too small an organism to be completely stopped by a barricade such as a mask. So we are moving into dangerous territory. There's no way in which we can claim to have the disease under control now, but in any shape or form. What we hope for is that during level 5 and 4, government has done enough to ensure that there are enough beds, hospital beds, there are enough intensive care rooms, there are enough ventilators for people who may need them, and that there are enough PPEs for health workers. This is what really level 5 does. It slows down the infections. It gives government the space to close gaps in areas where there are gaps in the national health system. So one hopes that all of that has been done and that all the testing that needed to be done has been done in these 2 top levels so that we have a clearer picture of where we are as a country. But we are by no means out of danger. If anything, we are still very much in danger, and we can never go back to things as they used to be. There is no way that we can go back to that. We must say farewell to the hug, to the embrace, to the handshake, all those colorful African handshakes where people shake each other in 9 different ways. All of that is gone. And all the crowding that we have seen either at cinemas or at music shows or at religious occasions, all of that is probably gone for the next 2 or 3 years, and maybe some of this will never return.
Yeah, well, I think for me, it's more that is probably the best way to greet people with the sharp, based upon what you've just said, right? Let's talk about poverty. Those lines have snaked in their thousands in predominantly township areas, so predominantly the disadvantaged communities of South Africa. Social distancing kept to a minimum there because that's exactly the reality of those many people in our country, right? But is the issue of people dying through absolute starvation, is that a real possibility?
Well, it is. It is very real. Even without COVID-19, even without a lockdown, there were far too many South Africans starving. We are an unequal society. So it's not guesswork when we say people are dying of poverty. In fact, every day on national media platforms, we see South Africans stepping forward to say, I am hungry. I don't know what we will eat tomorrow at this time. So that's a reality. You know, I was very sad when one particular observer of the situation compared the long queues of people lining up for food with the long queues of 1994, people going to vote. I think one particular media house had the 2 pictures side by side of people lining for voting in 1994 and people lining for food. It shows you how far we have come as a country or how far we have not come. That even though we had that line for voting in 1994, we still have this line for food 25 years, 26 years later, as it were. So it's a very real possibility. Often, when you have a national disaster, when you have an economic disaster, governments tend to bail out the big companies, the rich. They've done it again and again. In 2008, during the economic meltdown across the world, every government was bailing out the big boys, as it were, the banks and all of that. This time around, we have to remember to bail out the poorest of the poor. If we don't bail them out, this situation of inequality is going to catch up with us, and the levels of social unrest and instability that we will go into as a country may become uncontrollable.
But has anything indicated that in fact the poorest of the poor are being bailed out?
I am not satisfied that the efforts that are being done now are enough. In fact, I was quite embarrassed when suddenly our government indicated that it was able to take water to rural areas that have never had water for the longest time. When suddenly our government indicated that it will be able to assist the homeless. And I thought, where have you been all this time around? Did it have to take the novel coronavirus for our government to do what it should have done all along? And this is the challenge, that we are now trying to do what we could have, what we should have done a few years back. Had we done what we ought to have done, perhaps we would handle this crisis a little better. That said, one has to be thankful that the homeless have got shelter in some areas, that the poor have got water in some rural areas, which they have never had for the longest time. But it's a shame that we have to do this at this time. Is it enough? I don't know. Will it be sustained? Will there be water in that rural area post-COVID-19? Or is this part of the show, or part of the emergency knee-jerk reaction of government? I hope not. And is 350 rands per month enough for those who are getting grants? Is it enough to add rand on what they get? I'm not so sure that it is enough, because there are many, many South Africans who only get paid at the end of each day. Not to speak about those who are not employed at all. And so I see a problem, and I hope that government continues to think about ways in which to bail out the poor and not just bail out the rich.
So help us answer that question. So yes, 26 years into a democratic project, we can tick off at least 10 very, very fundamental things, but basic, that has not been delivered to the vast majority of South Africans, right? So we know that's a reality, and COVID-19 has exposed that. But cast my mind back, why has that been allowed to happen over 26 years of non-service delivery?
Ashraf, it's a real shame. It's a crying shame. Part of it is that our economy has not performed at a high enough level. Obviously, that is the textbook answer to your question. That is what every politician will say if you ask them that question, that we have had an economy that has not been pumping, and for that reason, we have not been able to meet all the needs. But part of it is corruption. State capture is just one dimension of corruption. It's not even the whole of the corruption that we have seen in this country. Part of it is our leaders taking advantage of the goodwill that South Africans have shown. Their patience, because South Africans have been told, wait, we are coming to assist you. Rome was not built in one day. We will get to you. And they've been patient and they've been taken advantage of. And I don't know that there has always been political will. When I look at the manner in which our politicians have behaved over the past 25 years, corruption is one thing, crass materialism among and between them has been shocking in many, many ways. You just have to go to the State of the Nation address and see all the parades with the jewelry and the stuff that they wear and the way in which they conduct themselves. So I'm not convinced that we have had a government and a set of leaders who have been as conscious of the need to close the gap, the inequality gap, as they should have been. I'm not convinced of that. I can't understand why a village in the Eastern Cape, women have to wake up early and make a queue to go and draw water. Why in a village in Limpopo, several villages, you still have that situation. In some of these places, you even have dams. And there's been project after project to pipe the water to the people, and the water has never reached the people because in between the time, there's been too much corruption. So I think lack of will and lack of leadership is pretty much part of the problem, as well as the economic issues that one has referred to.
Okay, what about the response from civil society and business, and indeed I say big business and small business, in dealing with the COVID-19 fallout? What can you tell us about that?
Well, part of the problem with, I think the sun is probably beginning to play havoc with my picture. But part of the problem with the lockdown is the manner in which civic society organizations have also been shut down. And I think this is something that could have been thought more carefully about. Government has never had capacity on its own to deliver services. It has always relied on civic society organizations, on religious organizations, on NGOs of all manner, many of which have been told, go sit at home. And I think that has been a mistake in terms of how we have dealt with this particular crisis. Big business could have done more also in terms of assisting. I note the big amounts that have been donated by some big businesses. Mm-hmm. I also note the partnerships that have developed between government and some of the big businesses. I wish that more of that had been done by more businesses, including the non-official businesses. I'm talking about the churches that make lots of money, who have been quiet at this time, have not seemed to be wanting to give back to the community. I'm talking about our millionaires, few as they are. I haven't seen them doing much at this time. It could be that I've missed it. So there's always room for improvement, to answer your question briefly.
Okay, and interesting. I think most of the cabinet ministers sort of giving up 30% of their salaries for 3 months, which is going to come up soon, as a gesture to fight the commitment around COVID-19. A suggestion. Okay, let me just repeat that. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Right. So I'm saying there's been a sense. Well, we know that cabinet ministers have given off 30% of their salaries to fight the COVID-19 cause. However, there's been another school of thought to say, for the majority of people in fighting COVID-19, they've had massive losses of income. People have lost jobs. People have lost businesses. People have lost revenue streams. If you ask me, I'm earning less in the last 3 months than I've earned before. That can be dittoed across the board, right? So the school of thought is this: forget the 30% discount that cabinet ministers and MPs are giving us. What about them only earning 30%? Because they must equally bear the brunt of the serious problem we're all facing. So they must earn 30 and give off 70 as opposed to give off 30.
Well, I would support that, but I think first we have to acknowledge the nobility of the gesture from members of parliament and cabinet ministers in taking a salary cut. I think that was exemplary, and this is one of the good things that the president has done in terms of leading by example and encouraging members of his cabinet and members of parliament to do that. Of course, they could have done more. And all these CEOs who earn huge amounts of money, I wanted to use an adjective I have been wise not to use, but who earn huge amounts of money, one would expect them also to give up something. This is a time that is this is the element of philanthropy, and not just philanthropy of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation level. Philanthropy of ordinary South Africans giving back. Suppose that's what the Solidarity Fund is intended to encourage. We need a lot more of that. My sense is that this expectation that only government, and of course government has got a big purse, even that purse is going to dry out sooner or later as tax income drops, and as the economy goes down. It's already, I don't know how much further down our economy can go. Yeah. So there's always room for more that can be done by big business and the more fortunate in South African society.
What are your thoughts about what appears to be an increasingly obvious narrative that certainly many of the mainstream media houses, and now it's even online, have been pushing an agenda in the last couple of weeks, almost discrediting government for extending the lockdown and moving full scale ahead to save the economy, and making the comparison that, yes, more people will die because of a failed economy than because of COVID-19. But the point I want to make is, do you get a sense there's been an orchestrated campaign by certain players played out through the media and encouraged by the media?
Well, I wouldn't want to generalize about that. You know, if you look at the phenomenon of lockdowns globally, there is almost stages of lockdown. Now, there's a famous book about the stages of dying. You know, how people start with denial and they go to bargaining and then they go to acceptance eventually. I can't remember all the 5 stages. And there's a sense in which there are 5 or 6 stages of the lockdown. And we have reached the stage of desperation in the country. And so some members of the media have been writing against the lockdown, and some individuals, I mean, Professor Glenda Gray is a particular person, a member of the Ministerial Advisory Committee, who has been reported to have said that the lockdown is unscientific, if not in itself, at least in the manner in which it is being implemented. I wouldn't go that far. Because I don't think if the lockdown is unscientific, then the whole world has been unscientific, and so perhaps the coronavirus is unscientific. So I wouldn't go that far. And some people have gone very far in criticizing government. But I see it as a phase or the stage at which we are in the lockdown. 55 days later, certainly more than 50 days later. But these easy either or choices that people are putting forward are actually inane. They are not helpful at all. It's not a choice of whether you kill the economy or you let people die, or you save the people and kill the economy. The two are related. It is both ends all the time. It's the same thing happens when people talk about the health system. So if you go to the UK, they say, save the national health system. So the national health system becomes a person. let's save it. In that way, they are saying if you can save it, you may save more lives, save the economy. It's not either or. It's not either you save the national health system or people, or you save the economy or people. You need to save both. And I think it's just signs of desperation that people are saying, making all sorts of projections and saying more people will die from economic deprivation than from COVID-19. We don't want people to die. And whether people die of COVID-19 or economic deprivation, they still die. And the aim is that the right to life should take precedence at this time. And I believe that that's what we all should be pushing for. I don't know that there's been a media campaign. I think it's just people desperate,
Okay.
individual people very, very desperate, under intense economic pressure. Some of them are CEOs, some of them are employers of fellow human beings, and they are worried about not just about their company, but the prospects of the people that they employ.
Okay, so before we wrap up, then perhaps your thoughts in terms of up to now, as level 3 is imminent. Who has been the big losers and the big winners in South Africa in terms of the management around COVID-19?
Well, your last qualification of the question throws me out a little bit, but let me say what I think. Of course, the big winners have been the big supermarkets who have been operating from day one of the lockdown, who have been allowed to operate at one stage to operate alone when there were not the spaza shops and the street vendors have not been allowed to work at all. And we have seen many of them take advantage of that. And the pharmacists, as it were, have also won a big time. They even increased prices. I mean, one of the funniest things is that in the first week of just before the announcement of the lockdown, I went and bought sanitizers for a quarter of the price that I bought them just the day after the lockdown. And so, economically, you could call them a big winners. And the big losers are the tobacco companies. The big losers are the hot food, merchants in the country. And those who are still now locked down have lost a lot in that sense. But I suspect that when you talk about winning and losing, you're not just talking about business. You're talking about who have performed well, who have managed the situation well so far. My sense is that government has tried. If I were to give them a score out of 10, I would still give them 8 for the manner in which they have acted with courage, with timeliness, and the extent to which they have tried to explain their decisions, often fumbling and bumbling around because many of the cabinet ministers are not trained communicators. But I think they've managed the situation well. I also want to say a word about the religious community, because this is a community that has been asked to stop meeting, to stop operating, and I have not had many complaints from them. I mean, I know that the tobacco lobby even attempted or threatened to go to court, but the religious community has been amazing in the extent to which they have tried to join hands, in inverted commas, because we're not allowed to join hands anymore in this COVID-19 times.
Hands on the
but
heart.
metaphorically speaking, they have attempted to join hands with government and have been very loyal and very supportive of the government effort. I really take my hat off to the religious community. But to South Africans in general and at large, I mean, think about South Africans and funerals. Funerals are a very important social dimension of South African cultural dimension of South African life. In fact, funerals are almost as important as religious ceremonies in South Africa, certainly in the Black community. But Black people have accepted restrictions that come with the COVID-19 lockdown, have been going to funerals in smaller numbers, have even accepted being told when they may bury and not bury. It is amazing the goodwill that South Africans have shown so far. And I think all of them deserve our praise and commendation at this time.
Okay, lastly, President Ramaphosa, he's standing in the midst of COVID-19. What does that happen? What has that done for him?
I'm so glad that the name of my president is not Donald Trump, and that his name is Cyril Ramaphosa. I think he has done a pretty good job so far. His addresses to the nation, save the last one, with which I was not very happy, were always dignified. His demeanor has been statesmanlike. And I think when we look down at his presidency 10 years, 15 years from now, we will have to include his management of COVID-19 as some of the best moments in his presidency. He has wobbled a little bit towards the end and seemed to want to please everyone. His penchant for consultation has not always helped him. His constant reference to National Command Council has also not helped him. His failure to call to order the likes of Bheki Cele in their miscommunication has also not stood him in good stead. His almost total silence about the deaths that have been caused directly or indirectly by the police and the army has also not helped. But overall, strategically, in terms of statesmanship, I think he has been excellent.
Okay, the last point, South Africa moving forward. So we're hoping we will have a scenario in a year, maybe less or maybe slightly more, that COVID-19 will be under control around the world. What would be the lessons South Africa should learn from its managing of COVID-19 that we can then take forward as a country?
You know, Ashraf, there is something that you and I are subjected to. We are told we must drive cars that are roadworthy. I want to take something from that metaphor. I think every country, I'm not sure where that sound is coming from. I hear some sound, but if you don't hear it, it's fine. Every country has got to be pandemic worthy, pandemic ready, for lack of a better phrase. And if there is something that South Africa owes itself, is to do everything that it can to be ready for the next pandemic. Pandemic readiness ought to become a global sustainable goal. It should be included among the SDGs, because if we are not ready for the next pandemic, it means that we are going to fumble and make the same mistakes that have been made. So one of the things that we need to learn is to make sure that we have the beds, we have the hospitals, we have the intensive care units, we've got the health workers, we have the quarantine sites, we have a structure nationally that just needs to be activated if a pandemic were to attack us as a nation. That is one thing that I think we can learn from this. The other thing that I think we ought to learn as a country is that perhaps look again at the National Disaster Management Act and the State of Emergency Act and see if we do not need a disaster that is health specific, so that there is not too much interference from other sectors when we are dealing with a health issue. I tried to explain this earlier in our conversation. I think for me, that is another very big lesson that we could learn. Now, here is another thought, Ashraf. So for 4 weeks, maybe 5, maybe 3, the skies were blue and empty. The beaches were clean and free of human beings. The botanical gardens and the game parks of the world were few of human beings. The world came to a halt. Factories closed, and nothing was. The highways, the freeways were empty. Now, I think we may want to create globally such a day or a week where everything shuts down and we give the world a break, the earth rather, we give the earth a break. I think this is good for the environment, good for the ecological battle that we have been trying to fight for so long, rather unsuccessfully and incoherently. I think if the world can come to agreement which week of the year we are going to shut down, it would be a good thing to do that. And finally, what COVID-19 has done is to show us how interrelated things are. So the ecology, health, the economy, the education sector, all sectors are interrelated. And it is this interrelatedness that we often miss, both at universities, but also as societies, that the world is interrelated. And not only are we interrelated in terms of spheres, but also nationally, our borders. So one of the sad things is this that I saw from January this year, let's say from February. Each country tried to fight COVID-19 on its own. So China would say travel bans. We're not allowing this and that people to arrive here. We are closing our borders. And then the next country will do the same. And then the next country will do the same. How much better would it have been if there was an international convention in terms of which all countries come to the same decision and effect the same provisions and regulations at the same time? We might have done a lot better if there was such synchrony between countries internationally than what I've seen. So for me, that is the other big lesson. The last lesson is that we will never go back. The future will never be the same again, and neither will the present. And so working from home will no longer be an exception. Learning from home may become the norm. And all of these things were available to us, but we were not doing them because we were not forced to. We thought they were optional. And I think we will reach a stage where only those workers who really must be physically present will go to work. And we have now the technology to do that. I think I should stop there.
Okay, well, lots indeed said. Appreciate your time. I'm certainly reflecting on some of those last comments. But well, certainly President Ramaphosa, but not Donald Trump. Point noted there. Then, are we pandemic ready? I think is a point worth noting. That week off, I think it's exactly where we need to be putting our minds to in a post-COVID world. And finally, I mean, some of those points that you've made in terms of the interconnectedness of the world. Well, I'll leave you with this bigger question and maybe for another day, which is, what then is the role of the United Nations? Appreciate your time, Professor Tinyuka Maluleke. Thank you so much for your wonderful insights. Really enjoyed it.
Always a pleasure talking to you, Ashraf. Thank you very much.